You want to get as far over here to the right-hand side as possible. Now, you might think, well, this is a little silly, right? Like, there's so much idealizing going on with these assigning numbers to pleasure and pain. Like, even if I agreed in principle with the abstract point, it doesn't really tell me much about like how I should actually go out and live my life. It doesn't give me any practical advice. So it's a worthwhile question to ask the hedonist, like, practically, what should I do to achieve maximal net pleasure? And here's a naive approach that some of the very early hedonists, the so-called Cyrenaics, actually did accept this view, but virtually every hedonist since then has rejected the naive answer to this practical question. The naive approach would be like, live for the moment, right? What you're trying to do in order to get a life of maximal net pleasure is get the most intense pleasures as often as you can, indulge for as long as you can, and when you pass out, wake up and do it all over again. That's how you get maximal net pleasure. That's the naive view, right? The kind of live for the now, party. When people hear hedonism, I think that's kind of what they think. It turns out, though, as you can probably imagine, this kind of lifestyle, while leading to intense amounts of total pleasure within a short period of time, almost inevitably, given the way we're set up psychologically, and also given the way we're set up socially, is causally produces some intense pain after that, and sometimes very intense pain. So if you've seen The Wolf of Wall Street, this is him like falling down the stairs, or is it him? Someone falling down the stairs, and in the long run, living for the moment tends to cause more net pain than pleasure. I mean, if you drink too much, you wake up with a headache. If you drink way too much, you might become addicted. And addiction can ruin a life in all kinds of other ways. So in the end, if you plug in, a +2 for that fun afternoon of drinking, you have to also plug in the -10 for the alcoholism on the other side. And so the net is going to be much lower. So Epicurus knows this, right? He's not stupid. He understands that this living for the now, the naive approach, just simply is not going to actually result in a life of maximal net pleasure. And so he does have some practical advice. Here's what he says. Pleasure is the first good and natural to us. But immediately after he says that, he says this: for this very reason, we don't choose every pleasure. So even though pleasure is the first good, according to him, and natural to us, we don't choose every pleasure. We all know that. Sometimes we pass over many pleasures when greater discomfort accrues as a result of them. And similarly, we think many pains better than pleasures, since a greater pleasure comes to us when we have endured pains for a long time. First time you go back to working out or running or exercising after having never done it or after having taken a long period of time off, intensely painful. But if you keep at it, your overall lifestyle gets so much better. You have more energy, you can focus better, you feel better about the way you look, and you're extending your lifespan, right? So it's worth indulging in some temporary pain to get that pleasure. And then likewise, I mean, Epicurus very much says, avoid the intense, seductive, and addictive pleasures, the drinking, drugs, right? Reckless sex and relationships. Those things, according to him, addict us to their intensity. And the more we indulge, often the less pleasure we're able to derive from them, but the more we crave them, and their lack gives us pain. And so over time, we end up with much more net pain than pleasure. He says, for it is not continuous drinkings and revelings, nor the satisfaction of lusts, nor the enjoyment of fish and other luxuries of the wealthy table which produces the pleasant life, but sober reasoning, searching out motives for all choices and avoidance, and banishing mere opinions to which are due the great greatest disturbance of the spirit. So the thing to do for Epicurus is, somewhat surprisingly, if you want to live the most pleasant life, be sober, calculating, and careful. And many of the pleasures that sort of the world considers to be most worthwhile turn out, in the end, reason tells us to avoid if we want to experience the most pleasure possible across a lifetime. You can read this passage. He talks a little bit about how, for him, prudence is a virtue, but its value is only derivative on the way in which being prudent and reasonable and even doing philosophy is valuable only insofar as it helps us to see which pleasures are worth pursuing and which ones aren't. So you can see this is a very sort of intellectual kind of hedonism. Okay, so suppose you're not convinced and you can't quite put your finger on why you're not convinced, maybe. Here's an argument against hedonism. And this is, we did a part of this on the first day of class. But now, having seen what this is actually a response to, it may make it even more sort of powerful, I think. So Robert Nozick was a American philosopher. I think his most famous work, he was very prolific, but one of his most famous works certainly was Anarchy, State, and Utopia. Very influential sort of libertarian thinker. This was 1974, and Nozick didn't just do political philosophy, he also did ethics and epistemology and metaphysics sometimes. But there's a really famous passage buried inside this book in which he challenges hedonism. He says, suppose there were an experience machine that would give you any experience you desired. Super duper neurophysiologists could stimulate your brain so that you would think and feel you were writing a great novel, or making a friend, or reading an interesting book. All the time, you would be floating in a tank with electrodes attached to your brain. Should you plug into this machine for life, pre-programming your life experiences? If you're worried about missing out on desirable experiences, we can suppose that business enterprises have researched thoroughly the lives of many others. You can pick and choose from their large library, selecting the life you want for yourself. And he says for the next 2 years, but we can kind of suppose it's a lifelong deal. I think that makes it a little cleaner. So this is a machine, the experience machine, this thought experiment. It's a machine that can give you any experience or series of experiences you want, including any of the most complicated and pleasant experiences you want, indeed across the rest of your life. And you won't know the difference once you're inside. So these are the 3 rules I kind of added. Nozick is not quite as explicit about these, but we're gonna suppose that the rules are: 1, once you plug in, you're in for life, so it's not just 2 years, you're in forever. 2, no one else goes in with you, so you don't get to access your family anymore. You can feel as if you are interacting with your family, but you won't be. And then thirdly, it's impossible to know that you're in the experience machine rather than reality. It's like the Matrix in that way, and one where Morpheus doesn't come in and get you. You have no idea that it isn't the real world. But nevertheless, here you are. If you plug in, you get to be this, think you're this violinist with this incredible career as a concert violinist. Do you plug in? Yes or no is the basic question. And Nozick thinks, and based on your reaction, you guys, on the first day of class, this wasn't universal, but the vast majority of you said, no, I wouldn't plug in, that's crazy. And it wasn't because you thought, I'm worried the equipment's gonna malfunction, right? We made sure that that wasn't the worry at the beginning. It's something else, something deeper than that, that even if you could be sure that this would all go well, something's missing that you want out of life, that you couldn't get in there, even though those experiences would be great. So this is the basis. It's not just a sort of fun thought experiment, but it's also the basis of an argument against hedonism. Here's the first premise. If hedonism is true, then it would be good for me to plug into the experience machine. Here's the second premise. It would not be good for me to plug into the experience machine. I want to say no if I'm given the opportunity to do this. From this, it follows that hedonism is false, because if it were true, then I should want to say yes, but I say no, right? That's the structure of this argument. This is a valid argument, has the same structure as this argument. If it's raining, then the ground is wet. The ground is not wet, therefore it's not raining. Sometimes called modus tollens, pretty intuitive. So the question is, are the premises true? And we've discussed in class the main defenses of the premises, but let's just walk through briefly why Nozick thinks that hedonism's truth implies that it would be good for me to plug into the experience machine. That is, why does he think that first premise is true? Well, here's the line of thought. If hedonism is true, right, just by definition, the good life is the life of maximal net pleasure. That's what we just did at the beginning of the video. But notice that because the experience machine is such that I can program any series of experiences at all into it, I can program into the machine that if I plug in, I'll live the life of maximal net pleasure. So if hedonism says that the best life is the life of maximal net pleasure, and I can get that in the machine, then I can get the best life in the machine. So if hedonism is true, then I can live the good life in the experience machine. Those two steps, definition of what hedonism says, and then noting that you can get that in the machine, that leads to, if hedonism's true, I can live the good life in the experience machine. Okay, why does Nozick think it would not be good for me to plug into the experience machine? Mainly, he thinks you'll basically just buy that claim. And sure enough, most of you did. You had that intuition. Another way of spelling it out is to list the reasons that you and others gave for not wanting to plug in. And those reasons, as we discussed on the first day, those are really your articulations of what it is that you want out of life, and what it is that you think has intrinsic value for you. What makes your life go better? And the things you listed, many of them are not experiences. They're often the causes of experiences, but they're not experiences or mere experiences. Nozick thinks really what all this indicates is that the life inside the experience machine would actually not be a good life at all. It might even be a very bad life. You'd be deeply deprived of many, many good things. It certainly would be significantly less than ideal, according to Nozick. It's a life that's missing in goods that are valuable and worth having apart from pleasure. Agency and freedom, character traits, moral virtues, knowledge of what's real and what's not, real relationships, not just the feeling of relationships, actual love, not just feeling love. Those things would be missing. And to the extent that you cite those things in saying, these are reasons I don't want to plug in, those are the ingredients of your kind of vision of the good life. And those are all reasons for you to reject hedonism. And I should note, just in closing, that someone like Aristotle, although of course Nozick is writing a very, very long time after Aristotle, and Aristotle wasn't thinking about experience machines, Aristotle would be very sympathetic with this argument against hedonism, because as we discussed, he is a value pluralist. He looks at the things on that list and says, yes, those all have value independent of their experiences. So there's in addition to the experience machine giving us an argument against hedonism, it also, you can think of it as motivating or giving us an argument for, or the beginnings of an alternative vision of the good life, which we get spelled out in more detail in Aristotle. All right, thanks.